The morning Ira Hunter looked up from his fence post 3 times in a row was the morning the whole town of Caldwell, Kansas decided that something extraordinary must have happened to the man, because in 11 years of living on the edge of that sun-baked, wind-stripped cattle town, Ira Hunter had never looked twice at anything that did not directly concern his land, his horses, or the weather coming in off the plains. It was the spring of 1879, and Caldwell sat on the border between Kansas and Indian Territory like a man leaning against a post he was not entirely sure would hold his weight. It was a rough-edged, ambitious kind of town, swelling with cattle drovers and hide traders and land speculators, and the particular breed of restless man who had come west looking for something he could not quite name. The Santa Fe Trail cut through its heart, and the Kishom Trail grazed its southern edge, and every season the Longhorns came up from Texas in their great lowing rivers and turned the streets to mud and noise and commerce. Caldwell was not pretty. It was not gentle. But it was alive in the way that only a border town could be alive, electric with possibility and danger in equal measure. Ira Hunter's property sat at the northern end of town, just past the point where the last of the commercial buildings gave way to open land. His gate was a simple thing, 2 cedar posts sunk deep into the Kansas earth with a crossbeam overhead, and a wooden sign hanging from it that read Hunter Ranch in letters he had carved himself 12 years ago when he first came to this country as a young man of 22 with nothing but a horse, a bedroll, and the kind of stubborn determination that either broke a man or built something lasting out of him. He had built something lasting. 160 acres of good grazing land, a solid barn, a stone-walled house he had constructed 1 wall at a time across 3 years, a small but well-regarded herd of mixed-breed cattle, and a reputation in Caldwell as a man of absolute reliability and very few words. He was 34 years old in that spring of 1879, and he was, by any reasonable measure, the most self-contained human being in the county. He had dark hair that needed cutting about a month past the point where most men would have cut it, and eyes the deep amber brown of creek water over flat stones, and hands that were the hands of a man who had spent more than a decade doing real work. He was broad across the shoulders and lean everywhere else, and he wore the same kind of clothing: everyday canvas trousers, a chambray work shirt, suspenders, boots that had been resoled twice. He owned 1 good vest and 1 good hat, and he wore both only when he went into town for supplies or business, which was not often and never for longer than was strictly necessary. The women of Caldwell had over the years made various efforts in his direction. He was not unkind to any of them. He was courteous in the precise, formal way of a man who has thought carefully about manners and decided they matter. But he had never looked twice. He had never lingered. He had never appeared to notice the careful arrangements of hair or the particular smiles that were offered specifically to him. It was not that he disliked women. It was simply that he was, in some fundamental way, absorbed completely in the life he had built, and that life did not seem to require anything more than what it already contained. And then Augusta Kendrick walked past his gate. She arrived in Caldwell on the morning stage from Wichita, on a Tuesday in April when the sky was the particular pale, brilliant blue that Kansas wore in spring like a dress it only brought out on special occasions. The stage was late, as it always was, and it came rattling and dust-raising down the main street at 9:30 in the morning, with the driver leaning back on the reins and the horses blowing hard after the long pull from the last relay station. Ira was at his gate because the latch had worked loose during the night wind and one side had swung wide, and he was crouched down examining the hinge mechanism when he heard the stage come in. He did not look up. Stages came in and stages went out, and they were not his business. But he did look up, a minute later, when he heard footsteps on the dirt road that ran past his property. Not the heavy, purposeful steps of a cattle hand or a businessman, but a lighter, more measured tread, the sound of someone carrying something awkward while trying to make it look easy. He saw her from the side first, because she was looking straight ahead, down the road toward the town center, with the particular focused expression of someone who has arrived somewhere new and is cataloging it carefully. She was carrying a large canvas bag over one shoulder and a smaller leather satchel in her opposite hand, and a hat box balanced somewhat precariously in the crook of her left arm. And despite all of this, she was walking with her chin up and her shoulders straight, with the kind of posture that spoke not of arrogance but of intention. She was, he registered in that first glance, perhaps 25 or 26 years old. She wore a traveling dress of dark blue cotton that was practical and modest, and showed clear evidence of a long journey in its dustiness. Her hair was the dark reddish-brown of polished walnut, pinned up under a hat that was tilted slightly by the weight of the hat box she was carrying. Her face was strong-featured, wide at the cheekbones, with a straight nose and a mouth that looked like it was accustomed to making decisions. That was the first look. A glance, no more than a second, the kind of thing a man does automatically when movement enters his peripheral vision. He went back to his hinge. But something made him look again, 3 seconds later, and this time he noticed that the hat box had shifted dangerously in her grip, and she had corrected for it with a small, graceful adjustment that kept everything balanced without breaking her stride, without changing her expression, without acknowledging that anything had nearly gone wrong. It was such a small thing. And yet there was something in it, that quiet competence, that refusal to let the difficulty show, that held his eyes a half-second longer than the first look had. He went back to his hinge again. He was tightening the last bolt when he heard a soft, specific sound. Not a cry, not a complaint, but a small compressed sound like a person makes when they absorb a pain quickly and quietly. And he looked up a third time to find that she had stopped, just at the edge of the road a few yards past his gate, and was standing very still with the hat box set down in the dust beside her and her head bent, examining something about the strap of her canvas bag that had apparently broken under the weight of its contents. She did not look around for help. She did not call out. She simply stood there in the spring sunlight, assessing the problem with the same contained expression she had worn walking down the road. Already, he could see from her posture, beginning to work out how to solve it without help from anyone. And Ira Hunter, who had not looked twice at anyone in 11 years, was now on his third look, and he found that this time he was not able to look away again. He straightened up from his crouch. He set down his tools. He walked out through his gate and down the road, and when he got close enough to be heard without shouting, he said, "Strap break." She looked up from the bag. Her eyes were gray, he saw, with a ring of darker color at the edge, and they were direct and steady and entirely unsurprised to find a man appearing from nowhere to ask her a practical question, as if she had assessed the situation and determined that practical help was the only kind she would accept. "The stitching on the shoulder piece gave out," she said. "It was already worn before I left Wichita. I should have had it repaired before the journey. I've got a needle and wax thread in the barn," he said. "Takes about 4 minutes to fix a strap like that properly." She looked at him. Not the quick assessing look she might have given a stranger in a city, but a direct, considering look, the look of someone who was evaluating not just what was being offered but who was offering it and why. "I don't want to trouble you," she said. "It's no trouble," he said. "I'm Ira Hunter. This is my property." She picked up the hat box and resettled it in her arm. "Augusta Kendrick," she said. "I would appreciate the repair if the offer stands." "It stands," he said. He picked up her canvas bag without ceremony and carried it back through his gate and around the side of his house to the barn, and she followed him with the leather satchel and the hat box, and neither of them said anything else until they reached the barn's cool interior. He found the needle and the waxed linen thread in his tool roll and sat down on a hay bale with the bag strap across his knees and began working. She sat on the hay bale opposite, hat box in her lap, leather satchel at her feet, and watched him work with the same direct attention she had given him at the road. "You're new to Caldwell," he said. It was not a question. "I arrived this morning," she said. "I've taken a position as schoolteacher. The school board hired me through correspondence with the county. I was told to report to a Mr. Hadley Davies at the land office. He glanced up. Davies, he's the chairman of the school board this year. Good man. His land office is on Commerce Street, third building past the feed store. Thank you, she said. Are you familiar with the school itself? Some, he said. They built it 3 years ago. Used to hold lessons in the church, but they outgrew that. The school has got about 30 students, aged 6 to 14 mostly, though they'll take older if there's someone willing to come. She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "What happened to the previous teacher?" He did not look up from the stitching. Married a rancher out of Barber County, left last October. They've been managing with a series of volunteers since then, but nobody's taken it on properly. He paused. The students have suffered for it. I gathered as much from the letters, she said. They were very particular about wanting someone with a full formal education and teaching experience. Have you got both? He asked. I have, she said, without the slightest trace of defensiveness. 4 years of schooling in Cincinnati and 2 years teaching in Wichita before this. She paused. I wanted something different, a town with more room to build something permanent rather than filling seats that someone else had already arranged. He finished the last stitch and ran the thread back through twice for security and bit it clean and handed the bag back to her. That'll hold, he said. Should have checked the whole strap length before you left, but this section's good now. She took it and turned it over in her hands, examining the repair. That's excellent work, she said, and she meant it. It was the tone of someone who knew good work when they saw it, not someone flattering a stranger. I've been mending things on this ranch for 12 years, he said. You get good at it eventually. She stood and resettled the bag. I'm grateful, Mr. Hunter, truly. She looked around the barn briefly at the clean stalls, the well-organized tools, the horses standing patient and well-fed in their places, and something in her expression suggested she was filing all of it away. This is a well-kept operation. I try to keep it that way, he said. She nodded once, picked up her satchel and said, Thank you again. I had better go and find Mr. Davies before the morning gets away from me. He walked her back to the road and watched her walk back down the road toward town with her bags resettled, and her hat straightened, and that same straight-backed, purposeful stride, and he stood at his gate for a full minute after she had rounded the bend and disappeared, which was, for Ira Hunter, approximately 55 seconds longer than he had ever stood watching anything that was not directly related to weather or cattle. He went inside and made himself a cup of coffee and sat at his kitchen table and thought about gray eyes with dark rings at the edge and a mouth that looked like it was accustomed to making decisions, and then he put those thoughts away firmly, the way a man puts away a tool he has no current use for, and went back to work. He did not put them away as firmly as he intended to. Augusta Kendrick settled into Caldwell with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had moved before and knew exactly how to do it. She found a room at the boarding house run by a widow named Clara Emmons on the west side of Commerce Street. A clean, small room with a window facing east that she said suited her because she liked to see the sun come up. She presented herself to Hadley Davies at the land office that first morning and spent 2 hours going through the school records and the existing teaching materials. And by the end of the week she had assessed the situation at the school, reorganized the classroom, written to a publisher in St. Louis requesting updated readers, and established a schedule that covered arithmetic, reading, writing, geography, and 1 hour a day of what she called natural philosophy, which meant she took the children outside and had them look at things and describe what they saw. The town noticed her the way towns notice someone new who is clearly going to matter. The women at the Sunday social came to their various opinions of her within the first 2 weeks. Some found her too direct, too unsmiling for their taste, too focused on her work in a way that seemed to deliberately exclude the social negotiations that made up much of women's daily life in a small frontier town. Others found her a profound relief, a woman who said what she meant and meant what she said, and was clearly not going to spread gossip or involve herself in the small theatrical productions of town politics. The men, for the most part, simply got out of her way when she was clearly busy, and came to her with their children's progress reports when she requested it, because she had, within the first month, established herself as the unambiguous authority on education in Caldwell, and nobody who saw her standing in front of 30 children with a piece of chalk in her hand, and that particular expression of organized determination, thought it wise to challenge that authority. Ira heard reports of all of this in the natural way a man hears reports in a small town, at the feed store, at the blacksmith's, in brief exchanges at the post office. He noted them without particular comment, the way he noted all information that came his way, storing it and turning it over at quiet intervals without appearing to do so. He had not sought out Augusta Kendrick after that first morning. He had not manufactured reasons to pass by the school or the boarding house or any of the establishments where he might reasonably expect to find her. He was not that kind of man. But he found that his mind returned to her at odd moments. When he was riding the fence line in the early morning, and the light was very clear, and his thoughts went where they wanted, or when he sat down to his evening meal in his stone-walled kitchen, and the house was quiet in the particular way a house is quiet when it has always been only one person's house, and you have only recently begun to notice. He went into town for supplies on the first Saturday of May, and saw her at the mercantile, standing at the counter with a list, ordering materials for the school. He could see from across the store that she was disagreeing with the owner, a florid, self-satisfied man named George Pickett, about the price of a set of primers. "These are the same primers available in Wichita for $1.40 a set," she was saying, her voice even and precise. "You are asking for $2.10. I understand the additional cost of transport, but that represents a 50% increase over market price, which is not reasonable, Mr. Pickett." Pickett was doing the thing he did with people he found inconvenient, which was to arrange his face into an expression of patient condescension and speak more slowly than necessary. "Miss Kendrick, I have to account for the cost of freight from. I've already accounted for it," she said. "The freight rate from Wichita on a package of this weight is approximately 12 cents. I've added that and a fair margin for your handling. My offer is $1.60 a set, and that is generous." Pickett opened his mouth. "Or," she said, without altering her tone in the slightest, "I write to the publisher directly and arrange for the next shipment to come through the school board rather than through your store, which is well within my authority as the appointed teacher." There was a silence. Pickett's face went through several colors. $1.65, he said finally. "Done," she said, and wrote it in her ledger. Ira had come up behind her without being noticed in the course of this exchange, and when she turned from the counter with her ledger in her hands, she nearly walked into him. She stopped and looked up. She was several inches shorter than him, though she stood very straight, and there was a brief moment of recognition, and then something else crossed her face, something that was almost amusement. "Mr. Hunter," she said. "Miss Kendrick," he said. "I see you've been introduced to Pickett's pricing philosophy." "I have now corrected it," she said, and there was the amusement, fuller now, coming into her eyes. He seemed surprised to find that it was correctable. "Most people just pay it," Ira said. "Most people haven't priced freight rates," she said. She looked at him steadily. "Are you in town for supplies?" "I am." She tilted her head slightly. "The school has a broken window on the east side. The frame is rotted through. I've submitted the repair request to Mr. Davies twice and nothing has been done. I don't suppose you know anyone who does carpentry work." He looked at her. "I do some carpentry myself," he said. "What does the frame look like?" She described it with the same precise economy she had applied to the primer pricing dispute: dimensions, type of damage, what glass size would be needed for the replacement. He listened and asked 2 questions, and said he could take a look that afternoon if she wanted, and she said that would be very useful. And that was how Ira Hunter came to spend his Saturday afternoon at the Caldwell schoolhouse. He brought his tools and a piece of good framing timber, and a pane of glass he had in the barn from a broken window repair on his own house the previous year, which happened to be nearly the right size and could be cut down. He worked on the window frame while Augusta moved around the classroom behind him, arranging the students' work on the board wall and organizing the shelf of books she had cataloged and labeled with small paper cards. She did not hover or supervise. She left him to the work and got on with her own, and there was something in that, the mutual assumption of competence, the working in the same space without the need to manage each other, that felt more comfortable than almost anything Ira could remember feeling in a long time. After a while she said, without looking up from her books, "Did you grow up in Kansas?" "No," he said. "Ohio. I came out in 1867. I was 22. "What made you come?" He considered this. It was the kind of question people asked in a certain way and expected a certain answer to, but she was asking it the way she asked everything, as if she actually wanted to know. "I had nothing particular holding me in Ohio," he said. "My parents were gone. I'd worked 3 years on another man's farm. I wanted land of my own, and Ohio was settled enough that the land cost more than I had." He fit the new timber section into the frame and checked it for square. "Kansas had the land. And you've never wanted to go back east?" "No," he said. "This is home." She was quiet for a moment. "I grew up in Cincinnati," she said. "My father was a schoolmaster. My mother died when I was 11. I had 2 younger brothers and a sister. I moved to Wichita when I was 20 to take a teaching position, and I thought I would stay there, but—" She paused. "It was already a settled town in its way. Everything was already decided. I wanted to go somewhere the decisions were still being made." He looked up from the window. She was standing at the shelf of books with one hand resting on the spines, looking out the window he had not yet repaired, at the flat golden Kansas afternoon. "Caldwell's got plenty of undecided things," he said. She turned and looked at him, and this time the amusement was quiet and warm and entirely unguarded. "I've noticed," she said. "I find I prefer it." He finished the window as the afternoon light went long and golden, and she locked the schoolhouse, and they walked back toward Commerce Street together in the natural way of 2 people who are walking in the same direction. She asked him about his cattle operation and listened to his answers with genuine interest, asking intelligent follow-up questions about grazing rotation and the cattle market at the end of the Kishom Trail. He asked about her curriculum, and she talked about it with an animated precision that was entirely different from the contained, assessing manner she wore for most of the world. When she talked about teaching, she became someone who had forgotten to be careful, who was simply thinking out loud about something she cared about completely. He noticed this. He noted it and stored it away. At the corner of Commerce and Main, where their paths diverged, his toward the feed store, hers toward the boarding house, she stopped and turned to him and said, "Thank you for the window, Mr. Hunter. I will make sure the school board pays you for the materials." "That's not necessary," he said. "It is necessary," she said firmly. "It's their window. They should be paying for it." She looked at him with that direct gray gaze. "But the labor I cannot adequately repay except to say I am genuinely grateful, and I mean that." "It was a good afternoon's work," he said, and that was true, it had been, in a way that went considerably beyond the satisfaction of a window frame properly fitted. She nodded once, as if that settled something, and walked on. He stood at the corner for a moment watching her go, and then he went to the feed store and bought his feed and drove home. And that evening he sat on his porch in the April dark and looked at the stars coming out over his land and thought about a woman who had moved to a frontier town because she wanted to go somewhere the decisions were still being made. He thought about it for a long time. He went back to the school the following Saturday, not to do any particular work, but because he had thought of something during the week. The school stove was an older model, and he suspected from the description of winter conditions Augusta had mentioned that it was not drawing properly, and a poorly drawing stove in a Kansas winter was not simply a discomfort but a genuine problem. He looked at the stove, and he was right. The flue had a partially collapsed section that needed relining, and he spent the afternoon fixing that too. Augusta brought him coffee halfway through the afternoon. Real coffee, not the thin version most people made, but strong and dark and properly brewed. And she sat on the edge of a student's desk and drank her own cup while he worked, and they talked, easily and at length, in a way that neither of them had apparently done with another person in some time. She talked about the students, about a boy named Thomas Reeves, who was 11 and brilliant at mathematics, and was being held back by parents who didn't see the point of schooling past what was necessary to manage a farm ledger, and about a girl named Lucy Marsh who was 8 and was reading 2 years above her level, and whose family didn't own a single book. She talked about these children with a fierceness of caring that was entirely unself-conscious, and he listened to every word, because he found that he could have listened to her talk for considerably longer than the afternoon allowed. He talked about his land, about the particular quality of the light on the plains in the hour before dawn, about the way the grass changed color through the seasons like a long, slow conversation, about the satisfaction of a herd that had come through a difficult winter in good condition. He was not a man who talked easily about such things, and he was mildly astonished to find that he was saying them at all, but she listened the way she seemed to do everything, with her full attention, not waiting for her turn to speak, but actually hearing what he was saying. When he left that evening, she walked him to the schoolhouse door and said, "You've been very kind to come back and do more work on this building. I want you to know I've spoken to Davies about payment. I told you the labor wasn't necessary." "And I told you it was," she said. "I'm glad we've had this conversation twice so we could both be clear on our positions." He looked at her, and something in him moved that he had not felt in a very long time, something warm and helpless and entirely involuntary. Because she was standing in the doorway in the evening light with that composed expression and the hint of amusement at the corner of her mouth, and he suddenly and absolutely had no interest in being anywhere else in the world. He said good night and walked to where his horse was tied and rode home, and he did not sleep well that night. Not because of any distress, but because his mind was too occupied to let him rest. They developed a rhythm, the two of them, over the weeks that followed, in the unacknowledged, natural way of two people who keep finding themselves at the same places at the same times because that is where they both want to be. He would come to the school on Saturdays ostensibly to check on the various repairs, and she would be there working on her lesson plans or marking student work, and they would spend the afternoon in the same warm, easy companionship that had established itself from the first. They walked together after the Sunday service, first once and then as a matter of course, down the tree-lined path behind the church and out along the edge of the creek that ran behind the town, talking about everything and about nothing, about books, and about the cattle market and the politics of the cattle trail, about the complications of Caldwell's position on the Kansas border with Indian Territory, which was a subject that required careful consideration and honesty. It was on one of these Sunday walks that Augusta said something that lodged in him and would not come loose. They had been talking about the complicated reality of the territory to the south, the forced consolidation of the tribes onto reservation land that had been going on for years, the steady erasure of a way of life that the railroads and the cattle operations and the town of Caldwell itself were all part of, whether or not the people involved chose to think about it. He had expected the polite discomfort most people expressed when the subject came up, the quick desire to move on to something easier. Instead, she said, "I think about it a great deal. I've read what I can find, though the available accounts are mostly written by people with clear interests in one direction. What strikes me is that the injustice is so systematic, so deliberate, that to simply participate in life out here without acknowledging it feels dishonest." She paused. "I can't undo it. I don't have the power to do that. But I can make sure the children in my school understand the full history, not just the version that makes the settlement sound inevitable and righteous." He looked at her. "That will make some parents uncomfortable," he said. "Yes," she said. "It will." "You intend to do it anyway." "I do." He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "Good." And he meant it completely, because this was exactly the quality he had been identifying in her all along without quite having the right word for it. Not just intelligence, not just competence, but a fundamental moral seriousness that ran through everything she did, that was not performed and not negotiable, and that he found, in ways he was only beginning to understand, more compelling than anything he had ever encountered. They walked back to town in a silence that was full and comfortable, and at the gate of the boarding house she stopped and looked up at him and said, quietly and directly, the way she said everything, "I've very much enjoyed these walks." "I have too," he said. And then, because he was a man who moved slowly and deliberately, and had learned to say precisely what he meant rather than more or less than what he meant, he added, "I would like to keep having them." She looked at him for a moment with those gray eyes steady and serious and warm, and then she said, "Then we shall." It was not until the end of May that anything approaching what the town would have recognized as courtship openly occurred. He came to the door of the boarding house on a Saturday evening with his good vest and his good hat, and asked if she would like to accompany him to the spring social at the Civic Hall. And she said yes with a simplicity and directness that made him feel he had been holding his breath for some time and had just exhaled. The social was the major gathering event of the Caldwell spring season, long tables of food, a fiddle player and a small band, dancing. The complex social event that small frontier towns organized themselves around in the way that was both genuine pleasure and a kind of collective affirmation that they were a community. Augusta wore a different dress from the traveling blue one, a green cotton that suited her entirely, with her hair done in a different way, less strictly contained than usual, and she looked, he thought, as though she had taken some private pleasure in the preparation that she was also not going to acknowledge. They ate together and talked with the various people of Caldwell who came to speak with them, and they danced twice. He was not a graceful dancer. He had told her honestly in advance, and she had said she was not particular about grace. And in the course of those two dances, with her hand in his and the fiddle making its bright, urgent sound, there was something that passed between them that was beyond the categories of friendship or partnership or mutual respect. That was purely and simply the recognition of two people that they were in exactly the right place, with exactly the right person. When he walked her back to the boarding house afterward, the town was quiet under a big Kansas sky full of stars, and they stopped at her door and he took her hand and held it for a moment and said, "Augusta." She looked up at him. "I'm not a man who says things before I mean them," he said. "So I want you to understand that I mean what I'm about to say very carefully." He paused, searching for the right shape of words. "In the 11 years I've lived in this town, I have never met anyone who made me want to change the terms of how I live. You have." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not sure exactly what to do with that, but I wanted you to know it." She was quiet for a moment, and in the starlight her expression was something he had not quite seen on her before, soft, unguarded, entirely without the composed exterior she usually wore, and entirely quietly beautiful. "I came to Caldwell because I wanted to build something," she said. "I didn't come looking for—" She paused. "But I find that I've been looking at you, Ira Hunter, since the morning you picked up my bag off the road, and I find I can't seem to want to stop." He held her hand for another moment and then brought it to his lips and pressed them there, very formally and very gently, and she smiled, a full, warm smile he had never seen from her before, the smile she kept behind all the others. "Good night," she said. "Good night," he said. He walked back down the empty street to where his horse was tied with a feeling in his chest that he had no particular name for, except that it was light and warm, and did not feel at all like something that should be put away. June arrived, and with it the full weight of the Kansas summer, the sky going wide and white at noon, and the heat coming up from the land in visible waves. Augusta kept the school running through the first 2 weeks of June, and then let the children out for the summer break, and turned herself to the project of preparing the fall curriculum. corresponding with publishers, making home visits to the families of students whose attendance had been irregular. Ira came to the boarding house on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, and they sat on the porch in the cooling air and talked, or he read to her from the newspapers he subscribed to from Topeka and Kansas City, and she read to him in return from the books she had brought from Cincinnati. And on weekends he took her out to his ranch and showed her what he was building there. She walked every part of his property with him, asking questions with that attentive precision that was already so familiar to him, and he watched her look at his land with the same focus she brought to her student's progress, as if she was trying to understand it on its own terms. She was, he came to see, a woman who gave everything her full attention or gave it nothing, who had no capacity for the politely interested half-attention that most social situations demanded. When she was present, she was entirely present. He found this both extraordinary and slightly overwhelming, because it meant that when her attention was fully on him, there was nowhere to hide and no desire to. One afternoon in late June, standing at the high point of his northern pasture where the land rolled out in every direction and the grass was tall enough to move in the wind like water, she turned to him and said, "Do you think about the future of this place?" "Every day," he said. "What do you see?" He looked out over the land for a moment. "I see more cattle, better bred. I see the buildings improved. I see," he paused. He was about to say, "I see it being enough," but found that this was no longer quite true. "I see it changed," he said, carefully, "different from what it is now." She was looking at him with that direct, considering gaze. Different how? He looked at her. The sun was behind her and the wind moved in her hair, and he had, at that moment, no interest whatsoever in being indirect or careful. "I see you in it," he said, "if you would be willing." She held his gaze for a long moment, and then she stepped toward him, and he took her hands in his, and she said, "I have been willing for some time, Ira. I was waiting for you to stop being so careful." He laughed, a real laugh, the kind that surprised him because it came from somewhere undefended, and she laughed with him, and he brought her close, and she let him, and they stood on the high point of his land in the June wind with his arms around her and her head against his shoulder, and the whole wide Kansas sky spread out over them like a benediction. He asked her properly, formally, in the way he did things that mattered, on the first Saturday of July. He came to the boarding house with a small box that he had carried in his chest pocket for 3 days, and Clara Emmons let him in with a knowing expression that suggested the whole boarding house had been aware of the general direction of things for some weeks. He sat across from Augusta in the small front parlor and said what he had to say without preamble and without theater. That he loved her, that he had come to understand in the past 2 months what it was he had been missing in the 11 years before she walked past his gate, that he was asking her to marry him and to share his life and his land with him, and that he would spend as many years as she gave him doing his level best to be worthy of her. She looked at him across the parlor table with those steady gray eyes for a moment that felt long and full of weight, and then she said, "Yes, Ira, yes." He opened the box and took out a ring, not a grand ring, not a jeweler's showpiece, but a simple gold band with a small pale blue stone set in it. And the stone was the exact color of the Kansas sky on a clear spring morning, which he had noticed and chosen deliberately. And when he put it on her finger, she looked at it, and then at him, and there was something in her face that was deeper than any expression he had yet seen from her. Something that was not composed or careful or unguarded, but simply true. They were married on the 15th of August, 1879, in the Caldwell church, on a morning when the heat was immense and the sky was brilliant, and the whole town came because Ira Hunter marrying anyone was an event of sufficient improbability that nobody intended to miss it. Hadley Davies stood up with Ira and Clara Emmons stood with Augusta, and the minister said the words, and they said theirs back with the equal clarity of two people who meant every syllable of what they were promising. Afterward, in the church hall, there was a wedding meal that half the women of Caldwell had contributed to, and the fiddle player came again, and there was dancing, and Ira danced with his wife 3 times instead of 2, and did not particularly care that his dancing was graceful or not. And Augusta looked at him across the room when they were separated by the ordinary social movements of a gathering, and smiled that particular smile, the warm, full one she had kept behind the others, the one that was only ever for him. He drove them home to his ranch, their ranch, that evening in his wagon with the horses stepping easy in the cooling air, and the plains were pink and gold with the going down of the sun, and Augusta sat beside him with her shoulder against his and his arm around her on the wagon seat, looking out at the land that was now hers too. "Well," she said quietly, looking at the stone-walled house as they came up the road toward it. "Well," he said. She looked at it for another moment. "It needs a garden," she said. He looked at her. "I've never grown one." "I know how," she said. "My father kept one. I'll show you." They went inside, into the stone-walled house that had been quiet for 12 years with only one person in it. And the quiet was different now. Not the quiet of absence, but the quiet of two people settling into a space together, learning the sounds of each other moving in the same rooms. The fall came on strong and early. Augusta reopened the school in September with a renewed enrollment of 34 students and a set of new readers she had argued out of the St. Louis publisher at a school rate, and the town of Caldwell observed with considerable satisfaction that its school had become what a school in a serious town should be, a place where children arrived willing and left knowing things. She also, as she had said she intended, began teaching the full history of the territory, including the history of the tribes whose land the town was built on, and the forced removals that had followed the Civil War, and the reality of reservation life south of the Kansas border. There were 3 families who objected, and Augusta met with each of them individually in the evenings, at her kitchen table with Ira nearby, and available as evidence of local standing if the conversations required it, and she listened to their objections with genuine respect, and then explained, in clear and specific terms, why she was not going to change what she was teaching. 2 of the 3 families remained enrolled. The third withdrew their children for a month and then brought them back, and the father, a cattle drover named Jessup, stopped Augusta on the street one afternoon and said, gruffly and without looking directly at her, that his boy Thomas had told him something the week before about the history of the Osage people that had made him think for several days straight, and he supposed that was probably worth something. She told Ira about it that evening, and he listened and then said, "I knew you'd manage it." "You weren't sure at all," she said accurately. "I was sure you'd manage it your way," he said. "I wasn't sure the outcome would go the same direction." She looked at him across the table. "Are you admitting you had doubts?" "I'm admitting I respect what you did," he said, "which is not the same thing as doubts." She considered this. "Fair point," she said. They had that kind of conversation, the kind of sparring exchange that is entirely affectionate and entirely honest simultaneously, with some regularity, and Ira had come to treasure it as one of the specific joys of being married to Augusta Kendrick, who would not be managed and could not be placated, and who, in the process of refusing either, made him sharper and more honest and more alive than he had been in longer than he could clearly remember. The winter of 1879 into 1880 was hard. Kansas winters could be brutal, and this one was a blizzard in January that kept the town confined for 4 days, temperatures that dropped below zero and stayed there for 2 weeks, cattle lost across the county. Ira lost 7 head from the north pasture herd, which was painful but manageable. He and Augusta spent those frozen days inside with the stove working hard, and the house full of the particular close warmth of 2 people weathering something together. She worked on her lesson plans and wrote long letters to her siblings in Cincinnati, and he repaired equipment and read and cooked, because he was, as it turned out, a better cook than she was, which was a fact she acknowledged with complete equanimity. They talked more in those confined winter days than they had talked in any equivalent stretch of time, because there was nothing to do but talk and read and be together, And what emerged from those long firelit evenings was the kind of knowledge of another person that only comes from that depth of sustained attention, the particular texture of each other's minds, the things that mattered most, the things that were hard, the griefs that were still present even if they had been lived with long enough to become something quiet and workable. She told him about her mother's death when she was 11, and the way her father had reorganized the family into a kind of quiet, competent grief that did not indulge itself, but also did not pretend. She told him about the brothers and sisters she had been largely responsible for in the years after, the younger children who had looked to her as the steady thing, which was, she thought, where her gift for management of difficult situations had been trained. He told her about his own childhood, which had been reasonably good but not close parents who were present and responsible, and who had managed their own farm in Ohio with the same steady competence he had brought to his own, but who had not been demonstrative, had not spoken often or warmly, and had left him with an interior life he had conducted mostly in silence because there had not been anyone in it who seemed to want the whole of it. "You could have told me it would be like this," she said one evening, looking at him across the fire with her feet tucked under her and a book closed in her lap. "Like what?" he said. "Like being known," she said simply. "You could have told me that being known by someone who is paying attention is what it actually feels like." He looked at her in the firelight and he said, "I didn't know until you." She looked back at him for a long, serious moment, and then she set down her book and came to where he was sitting and took his face in her hands and kissed him, and the fire made its sound and the wind made its sound outside, and the whole hard Kansas winter was entirely irrelevant. In February of 1880, Augusta told him she was expecting a child. He sat very still when she told him. She was watching him with that considering expression, trying to read him, which she was usually very good at and which was, he could see, giving her less information than she wanted in this particular moment. "Ira," she said. He looked up at her. "I'm trying to find the right words," he said. "Give me a moment." She waited with the patience she brought to things that mattered. "I didn't know," he said carefully, "that I wanted this. I hadn't let myself think about it, because for a long time it wasn't something I thought was going to happen, and thinking about things that aren't going to happen is not a useful occupation." He paused. "But I find I want it very much. I find that I have, without knowing it, wanted it for a long time, and I find that the fact of it right now is," he stopped, because the word was too large and too private for normal speech. She crossed the room and put her hands on his shoulders, and he pulled her close and held on to her with a fierceness that surprised him and apparently did not surprise her at all, because she held on to him with equal conviction. "Good," she said against his shoulder. "Then we are in agreement." They told Clara Emmons and Hadley Davies and the necessary people, and the town received the news with the warm satisfaction that small communities take in the pregnancies of couples they have collectively decided to approve of. Augusta continued teaching until June, at which point she arranged for a temporary teacher from Wichita to take the class for the last 2 months of the school year, with the understanding that she would return in September. Their son was born on the 9th of July, 1880, on a morning when the sun was already hot at 6 o'clock, and the meadowlarks were making their extravagant noise in the tall grass of the south pasture. He was a large, dark-haired, vigorous boy who announced his presence with considerable volume, and who, once cleaned and wrapped and placed in his father's arms, looked up at Ira Hunter with eyes that were, at that moment, a dark grayish blue that would later settle into the precise amber brown of his father's. Ira stood in the bedroom of his stone-walled house holding his son and looked at Augusta in the bed, who was exhausted and luminous and looking back at him with an expression he could not fully catalog except that it contained everything. "James," she said. They had agreed on the name weeks ago, her father's name. "James," he confirmed. He sat on the edge of the bed and held the baby between them, his wife's shoulder warm against his, the morning coming through the window in long golden bars, and he thought about the gate he had been fixing the morning she walked past, and the hinge that had worked loose in the night wind, and how entirely different his life would have been if it had held. He did not say this out loud, but Augusta, who was very good at reading him, looked at him with that knowing expression and said, "What are you thinking?" "About hinges," he said. She looked at him. "Hinges. The one on my gate," he said. "The morning you arrived. If it hadn't worked loose." She was quiet for a moment, considering this. "I would have found another way to introduce myself," she said finally. He looked at her. "Would you?" She looked back at him, steady and warm and entirely serious. "I looked at you 3 times, Ira Hunter," she said. "Did you not know that?" He had not known that. "You never said." "I'm saying it now," she said. A man crouched down at a gate at 8 in the morning with the whole wide Kansas sky behind him and that look of absolute concentration on his face. She smiled. "I would have found a way." He put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and James made a small, contented sound between them. And the meadowlarks continued their business in the south pasture, and Caldwell went on being itself in the distance. And the summer unrolled its long hot days around the stone-walled house that was no longer quiet in the way it had been, that was full now of the particular sounds of 3 people who were a family. The years that followed were not always easy. The cattle market had its hard seasons and its good ones. There was a drought in 1881 that tested every rancher in the county and required the kind of hard financial calculation that kept Ira up nights, running numbers in the kitchen, while Augusta sat with him and helped him think through the options with the same organized intelligence she brought to school budgets. They came through it without selling land, which was the line he would not cross, partly through careful management and partly through a contract Augusta had negotiated directly, on his behalf, with a beef supplier in Wichita who turned out to respond very well to a woman who knew freight rates. "You did not need to do that," he told her, the evening she told him about the contract, though his voice carried more admiration than reproach. "The supplier needed to be persuaded," she said. "I was available to persuade him. I don't see the problem." He had no response to this except to look at her across the table with a feeling that was, by now, an established and permanent resident in his chest, warm and unassailable, but that still occasionally astonished him by its dimensions. Augusta returned to the school in September of 1880 as she had intended, bringing James with her for the first months, settling him in a crib at the back of the classroom while she taught. The students were enormously interested in him, which she managed by allowing 15 minutes of supervised interest per day, and then firmly redirecting everyone's attention to their lessons. By October, James had become a fixture at the school, and several of the older students had taken a proprietary interest in his welfare, which Augusta noted as an educational development she had not anticipated but found entirely acceptable. Clara Emmons, who had become genuinely fond of both of them, offered to look after James at the boarding house for the mornings, which gave Augusta the full use of her classroom, and Clara the company she had not admitted to wanting. This arrangement, once established, became a permanent feature of Caldwell life for the next 2 years. Thomas Reeves, the mathematically gifted boy Augusta had been championing since her arrival, was brought to Ira's attention in the fall of 1881. Augusta came home one evening with a particular expression on her face, the one that indicated she was about to ask him something that she had already thought through considerably, but which was going to require his participation. "Thomas's family are moving to Barber County in March," she said. "His father has land there, which means Thomas will leave the school." "That's unfortunate," Ira said. "His father is not a bad man," she said. "But he is practical in the narrow sense. He doesn't see the value of further education for Thomas beyond what he's already got. Thomas wants to go to the college at Lawrence. He's more than capable of it. He needs someone to write a letter of recommendation to the admissions board, and he needs a small financial guarantee of support in his first year." Ira looked at her. "You've already written the letter." "I have." She paused. "The financial guarantee requires someone of standing in the county." He looked at her for another moment. "How much?" She named a figure that was significant but not impossible. He considered it. "What are the chances the boy actually goes?" he said. "Near certainty," she said. "If we give him the path, he will walk it. He is that kind of person." He thought of himself at 22 with nothing but a horse and a bedroll and a determination that had eventually become something lasting. He thought about paths and who made them and who provided them. "All right," he said, "bring me the letter." Thomas Reeves went to the college at Lawrence in the fall of 1882, and 3 years later he wrote to Augusta from his position as a junior engineer with the Kansas City Railroad Company, and the letter was in her permanent collection, folded and refolded from reading, for the rest of her life. On a Thursday afternoon in November of 1882, Augusta came into the kitchen of the ranch house with the look that Ira had learned, over 3 years of marriage, to read with some accuracy, the quiet, contained look that preceded significant news. "I believe we will need another bedroom," she said. He set down what he was working on and looked at her. "Spring or summer?" She sat down across from him and looked at her hands and then at him, and that soft, unguarded expression came over her face, the one that was only ever for him. "June, I expect." He came around the table and took her face in his hands, and she put her hands over his, and they stayed like that for a moment in the November kitchen with the stove warm and James asleep in his room down the hall. "Two," he said. "Two," she agreed. Their daughter arrived in the first week of June 1883, on a cool morning entirely unlike the summer heat of James's birth. A quiet, watchful baby who looked at the world from the first with her mother's gray eyes and her father's expression of intent assessment, as if she was cataloging everything and had decided to reserve her judgment until further evidence was available. They named her Clara for Clara Emmons, who came to the ranch to see her namesake on the second day and held her with a formidable tenderness and said to Augusta, without any particular elaboration, "You done right coming here." Augusta looked at her and said, "I know it." Caldwell grew through the early 1880s in the way of successful cattle towns, more buildings, more commerce, more people with more complicated interests. The cattle trade continued, though already there were discussions in the county and in Topeka about the future of the open range, about the fencing of the plains that was coming steadily from the east as more settlers arrived, about the long conflict between the cattlemen who needed open routes north and the farmers who needed protected crops. These were arguments that played out in the newspapers and in the civic hall and in the feed store, and Ira was present for enough of them to know which way things were going, and to begin, quietly and without advertising the fact, adjusting his operation in the direction of something more sustainable than open-range cattle and trail drives. He converted part of his acreage to hay production and contracted with a grain dealer in Wichita. He reduced his herd and improved its quality. He put up better fencing and developed a relationship with a buyer in Kansas City who wanted quality beef rather than volume. These were not glamorous decisions, but they were the right ones, and Augusta, who tracked the financial details with the same sharp attention she brought to school budgets, confirmed this repeatedly and with satisfaction. The school continued to be Augusta's central occupation and her greatest source of satisfaction. By 1883, it had grown enough to require a second classroom, which the school board, now thoroughly accustomed to Augusta's management style, approved without the resistance it might have offered a teacher with less established authority. Augusta selected and trained the second teacher herself, a young woman from Topeka named Helen Marsh, no relation to student Lucy Marsh, who turned out to be an excellent choice, and who, within 2 years, had become Augusta's closest professional colleague and a regular dinner guest at the ranch house. James grew into the particular boy he had suggested. He was going to be from his first hour large, curious, energetic, possessed of his father's steady disposition, and his mother's absolute refusal to be fooled about anything. At 3, He was already asking questions with the specificity that made visiting neighbors mildly exhausted and his parents quietly delighted. He followed Ira around the ranch with a solemn attentiveness, watching everything his father did and attempting to replicate it on a small scale. And Ira had the steady, grateful sensation of a man who is watching something important unfold and knows enough to stay out of its way while it does. Clara was quieter, more interior, which did not mean she was not paying attention. She was always paying attention. She simply conducted it in private, and what came out of that privacy when she was ready was usually startling in its precision. She had her mother's gray eyes, and it seemed her mother's gift for organization, applied to her small world with a seriousness that her parents found both endearing and occasionally humbling. In the spring of 1884, Caldwell had its last major cattle season as a true trail town. The railroads had moved and shifted, and the Kishom Trail's northern terminus was already being disputed. The following years would see the trail traffic diminish and then effectively end, and the town would transform from a cattle trading post into something more like a settled agricultural community, which was both a loss of a certain wild vitality and the gaining of a different, more permanent kind of life. Ira and Augusta sat on the porch of their ranch house one evening in late May of 1884 and watched the last of a big Texas herd move up the road past their property in the late light, the longhorns moving in that great lowing mass that had been the sound and smell and spectacle of Caldwell for 15 years, and the cowboys riding alongside, dusty and capable and bound for the pens in the market. "End of something," Augusta said. "Yes," he said. She looked at him sideways. "Are you sorry?" He thought about this honestly. "Some," he said. "This country was built on something that required a certain kind of freedom to work. The freedom is going to be different now." He paused. "But what comes next can be good too if it's built right." She took his hand, which was something she did when she agreed with something completely and wanted to confirm it physically. He folded his fingers over hers. "We'll build it right," she said. "We will," he said. They sat on the porch until the herd had passed and the dust had settled, and the evening air came clean off the plains. And James was asleep inside, and Clara was asleep inside, and the stone-walled house was solid behind them, and the land rolled out in every direction in the spring green. And Ira Hunter, who had once been a man who had never looked twice at anything that did not concern his land or his horses or the weather, put his arm around his wife and looked at all of it and found that it was, in every possible measure, enough, that it was, in fact, more than enough, that it was everything. Clara Emmons died in the winter of 1885, quietly and without much difficulty, which was exactly how she had said she wanted to go, in her room at the boarding house that had been her home for 20 years. She left the boarding house to a niece in Topeka, and left Augusta a small brass clock that had sat on the mantelpiece of the front parlor for as long as anyone could remember. Augusta placed it on the mantelpiece of her own kitchen, and it kept good time for the rest of her life, and she never looked at it without a feeling of warm, affectionate gratitude. They had a third child, a son, born in the fall of 1886, named William after Ira's father. William was fair where his siblings were dark and easygoing where they were intense. A smiling, practical, sensible boy who seemed to have decided from the beginning that his place in the family was to be the one who made things run smoothly, and who fulfilled this function with such natural good humor that nobody ever found it anything but a pleasure. Hadley Davies retired from the school board in 1887 after a decade of service, and at his farewell dinner, held at the Civic Hall with half the town in attendance, he made a speech in which he said that the best decision he had made in 10 years as board chairman was hiring Augusta Kendrick, and he said it in the specific, particular way of a man who had had to be persuaded of the decision at the time and had been comprehensively correct about the result. Augusta received this with the composed expression and genuine warmth that she brought to all public recognition, And then she gave a speech about Thomas Reeves and Lucy Marsh, and every other child whose education had been the actual point of the whole enterprise. And several people in the hall were moved to the kind of tears that surprise people. Ira watched his wife from his seat at the long table and thought, as he had thought on 100 previous occasions, about the morning she had walked past his gate, and about the 3 times he had looked, the first time, the second time, the third time that had been the beginning of everything. And he thought that whatever force had worked the hinge loose the night before her arrival had done it with a purpose that he had, in 6 years, never stopped being grateful for. He caught her eye across the room after the applause had died down, and she looked at him the way she had looked at him from the beginning, directly, steadily, warmly, and she smiled. And it was the smile she kept behind the others, the full, warm one, the one that was only ever for him. In the years that settled around the ranch like the good Kansas summers settled around the land, generous and warm and full of light, the Hunter family became what the town of Caldwell thought of, without particular ceremony, as one of its defining institutions. Not in the way of power or wealth or civic prominence, though Augusta continued to shape the school and Ira continued to be the man whose word on a contract or a character was worth more than a written document, but in the simpler, more lasting way of a family that had built something real and meant to go on building it. James at 7 was helping his father in the barn with a serious competence that made the ranch hands Ira had 2 now. A young man named Carter and an older hand named Pete, who had come up from Texas on one of the last drives and decided to stay, treat him with the same respectful courtesy they offered Ira himself. Clara at 4 was already being taught to read by her mother, which turned out to be a process of moderate chaos, because Clara had opinions about which letters were interesting and which were not, and was not shy about expressing them. William was a baby in the cradle beside the kitchen stove, watched over by James with the frowning protectiveness of a 7-year-old who has decided that this new development is his personal responsibility. Augusta and Ira fell into the daily rhythms of a life that was full in every dimension, full of work and children, and the particular, complex commerce of a frontier community entering a different era, full of the seasonal demands of the land, full of the quiet evenings on the porch and the long conversations in the kitchen and the Sunday mornings when they lay in the extra half hour before the house woke up and talked about everything and nothing in the lazy, intimate way that is only available to people who have chosen each other completely. There were hard times, a second drought in the late 1880s, a year when the cattle market fell hard and the financial calculations were brutal, a winter when William had a serious illness that frightened them both badly before it resolved. There were the ordinary difficulties and the occasional extraordinary ones, and through all of them the essential thing held: the trust, the mutual respect, the absolute conviction that whatever was coming they were better equipped for it together than separately. Augusta, in her 9th year at the Caldwell School, wrote a letter to the State Board of Education in Topeka, recommending changes to the standardized curriculum for frontier schools, changes based on her own experience of what children in a cattle and farming community actually needed to know, and what approaches actually worked with children whose lives were full of practical demands alongside academic ones. The letter was detailed and specific and grounded in 9 years of evidence, and the board, which had been accustomed to receiving general complaints or general praise from local teachers, received it with some surprise and considerable interest. 2 months later, a representative from the board's curriculum committee came to Caldwell and spent 2 days in Augusta's school and 1 evening at her kitchen table, and the outcome of these visits was a formal correspondence relationship between Augusta and the state board that would, over the following years, result in genuine changes to the way frontier schools were run across Kansas. She told Ira about the first letter from Topeka confirming the curriculum committee's intention to adopt her suggestions, and he read it at the kitchen table while she watched him, and when he put it down he looked at her with an expression she had catalogued over 9 years as the one he wore when he was feeling something too large for easy expression. "Well," he said. "Well," she agreed. "You're going to change the schools," he said. "I'm going to try," she said. "You'll succeed," he said. "You always do." She looked at him with that warm, unguarded expression. "You have always believed that," she said, "from the very beginning." "I've seen your work," he said simply. A man would be a fool not to believe it. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, and he turned his palm up and held it, and they sat in their kitchen in the lamplight with the sound of their children asleep in the rooms down the hall, and the planes quiet outside, and the brass clock on the mantel ticking out the steady minutes of a life that was theirs, entirely and permanently theirs. The cattle trail era ended formally for Caldwell in 1885, when the quarantine line moved and the Texas herds were redirected elsewhere. But by then the town had already been changing itself into something different, more agricultural, more settled, more like the towns further east that it had once looked at with a mixture of envy and disdain. The wildness was going out of it, which meant some things were lost and some things were gained, and Ira observed this transformation with the steady equanimity of a man who had learned to distinguish between what was essential and what was circumstantial. What was essential had not changed. The land was still the land, still wide and difficult and beautiful, still demanding everything and giving back in proportion to what you put in. His herd was smaller but better. His buildings were improved. His property was, after 14 years of work, exactly what he had come to Kansas to build. And the stone-walled house that had been silent for 12 years was full of voices now, 3 children's voices, and his wife's voice and his own, which he used more readily than he once had, because he had found in the years of his marriage that words spoken to someone who was fully listening were entirely different things from words spoken into a silence that had no one on the other side. On a Sunday morning in the late spring of 1889, the year Kansas was celebrating the 2 decades of its statehood, and the whole country seemed to be in a mood for assessing what had been built and what it meant. Ira came out of the barn after the early feeding to find Augusta already on the porch with 2 cups of coffee, sitting in one of the 2 chairs he had built the summer after James was born, looking out at the morning. James was 10 now, and Clara was 6, and William was 3, and all of them were still asleep in the house behind her. The morning was perfect in the specific way of late Kansas spring, warm already, with a light wind carrying the smell of grass and the sky a clear and particular blue. He sat beside her and took his coffee, and they sat together in the morning quiet, looking at the land, and after a while he said, without having planned to say it, "Do you remember that you told me on one of our first walks that you wanted to go somewhere the decisions were still being made?" She turned to look at him. "I do." "Have they been made?" he said. "The decisions you came for?" She was quiet for a moment, looking out over his land, their land, at the grass moving in the morning wind, at the cattle in the far pasture, at the cottonwood trees along the creek that had grown considerably in 10 years and cast proper shade now. "Some of them," she said, "the important ones." She looked at him. "And some new ones have presented themselves which I did not expect but find I prefer. The kind that need more than one person to make." She paused. "I've come to think that the decisions don't stop coming. That is not a complaint." "No," he said, "it isn't." She looked at him with that expression, the warm, direct, fully present look that was the one he had fallen in love with first, the one he still found, after 10 years, capable of stopping him completely in his tracks. "I'm going to be honest with you," she said. "You always are," he said. "I looked at you 3 times that first morning," she said. "I told you that once before, but I want you to know that the 3rd look was the one where I thought this is someone worth staying for." She held his gaze steadily. "Before I knew your name, before you spoke to me, just from the way you were working at that gate." He looked at her for a long moment. The morning light was very clear, and the wind was in the grass, and the whole wide Kansas sky was overhead, and he thought about the hinge, and the bag strap, and the way she had walked down the road that first morning head up, shoulders straight, carrying everything herself and not asking for help, and yet, when help was offered, receiving it with absolute directness and genuine gratitude. "I looked at you 3 times too," he said. She smiled, the full, warm one, the one behind all the others. "I know," she said, "I noticed." He took her hand and she leaned against his shoulder, and they drank their coffee in the morning quiet. And presently the house behind them woke up, the creak of floorboards, James's voice, Clara's reply, William's more tentative contribution. And the day began, the way their days began now, with noise and warmth and the particular, irreplaceable life they had built out of a chance meeting at a gate on a dusty road in a cattle town at the edge of the world. The spring deepened into summer, and the Hunter ranch went on, and the school went on, and Caldwell went on becoming the next version of itself. And through all of it, Ira and Augusta Hunter remained what they had been from the beginning of their life together. A man and a woman who had recognized each other across a wide country in a brief and ordinary encounter, and had chosen, with full knowledge and without reservation, to make of that recognition something that would last. Their 4th child arrived in December of 1890, another son dark-haired, like his father and his oldest brother, with his mother's gray eyes and an expression, from his first days, of resolute cheerfulness that was entirely his own. They named him Samuel, after no one in particular, because they had agreed that the name fit him before he was a week old. James, who was 11 by then, and had long since decided that the role of older brother was his most important occupation, received Samuel with a solemn and devoted attention that made Augusta watch her eldest son and feel, in the way that occasionally overwhelmed her when she was not careful, the complete and specific weight of her gratitude. Ira built the 4th bedroom during the winter of 1891, adding it to the east side of the stone house in the patient, methodical way. He did all construction, measuring twice and cutting once, and making each joint right before moving to the next, so that when it was finished it looked as if it had always been there, as if the house had simply grown in the natural direction. Augusta stood in the doorway of the new room when it was complete and looked at the clean plaster walls and the window facing east, and she said, "It's exactly right." "I measured from the same plans as the rest," he said. "That's not what I mean," she said. She turned and looked at him across the new room, the winter light coming through the east window, and lying across the wooden floor he had laid himself, plank by plank. "I mean it's exactly right in the larger sense." She looked at him with those direct, steady gray eyes. All of it. He looked back at her. He thought about 11 years of solitude and 12 years of work and one April morning and a broken hinge and a woman who had walked past his gate and made him look up 3 times. "Yes," he said. All of it. Outside, on the plains of Kansas, the winter held the land in its quiet. Inside the stone-walled house that had started as one man's determination and become a family's home, the fire burned, and the children were various in their rooms, and the brass clock on the mantel kept its steady time, and the 2 people at the center of it all, the woman who had come looking for somewhere the decisions were still being made, and the man who had never looked twice at anyone in 11 years, held on to each other in the particular, permanent way of people who have found in one another the thing they had not known they were missing until the morning it walked past their gate. And it was, in every measure that mattered, the beginning that had become everything. The years that followed turned steady and good. The ranch prospered in the modest, genuine way of a property well managed and well loved. The school became what Augusta had always intended it to be, a place of real learning and real consequence, known well enough beyond Caldwell that families in neighboring counties spoke of it in terms that reflected back on the woman who had built it from a series of volunteers and a poorly drawing stove into an institution the whole county could stand behind. Samuel grew into a boy who laughed easily and worked hard, and had his mother's gift for knowing when to speak and when to simply be present. William turned out to have a talent for drawing that surprised everyone and pleased his mother enormously, and she found him, one spring evening when he was 9 years old, sitting in the south pasture making a detailed pencil sketch of the cottonwood trees along the creek, with a concentration so absolute that he did not hear her approach. Clara, at 12, was reading everything she could find and asking questions that neither of her parents could always answer, which they had both decided was precisely the correct outcome for a child being raised by a schoolteacher and a careful-minded rancher, and they directed her toward better questions when they could not provide better answers, and she grew on that in the direction they had hoped. James, as he came into his adolescent years, was already helping manage the ranch in ways that went beyond the chores of childhood. He had his father's eye for the quality of cattle and his mother's head for the financial arithmetic of it, and Ira had begun, quietly and without announcement, to show him everything, to walk him through every decision, to explain the reasoning behind each one as if he expected to be questioned about it, because he expected James to one day apply the same reasoning himself. Augusta watched her husband teach their son and thought about the man at the gate who had looked up 3 times and said, with the simplicity of someone who had not yet understood what was happening to him, "Strap brake." And she thought that whatever she had seen in him that first morning, the thing that had made her look the 3rd time, had been exactly this: the quality of full attention, the assumption of competence in others, the willingness to simply do the useful thing without ceremony. She was still teaching. She expected to be teaching for some years yet. The curriculum she had helped revise for the state board was in use across most of western Kansas, and the letters that came from Topeka, and occasionally from as far as Denver and Santa Fe, were evidence of a reach she had not anticipated but had decided to take seriously and be worthy of. She wrote careful letters in return, from her kitchen table in the evenings after the children were asleep, with the lamp burning and the brass clock ticking, and Ira reading across the table from her with his boots off and his feet stretched out, occasionally reading a passage aloud if it was something he thought she should hear. This was the life. This was exactly the life. Not the grand frontier drama that the newspapers in the East imagined when they wrote about Kansas and the Wild West, not the romantic wilderness adventure, but this specific, ordinary, irreplaceable accumulation of days, each one adding something to what had come before, each one requiring something and giving something in return, each one ending in this kitchen with these 2 people across this table with the lamp between them. One evening in the late spring of 1893, when James was 13 and Clara was 10 and William was 7 and Samuel was 3 and the ranch was quiet and the day had been a good one, Augusta looked up from her correspondence and found Ira watching her with that expression she knew, the full, unguarded one that he usually kept as carefully as she kept her own, but which appeared sometimes when he thought she was not looking. "What?" she said. He shook his head slightly. "Just thinking," he said. "About what?" He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "About the fact that I am exactly where I am supposed to be." He looked at her. "That seems like a thing worth noticing." She looked back at him across the lamp, and her heart made that movement it still made, after 14 years of marriage, in response to his direct, serious attention. The movement that was the same one it had made the first time he had looked up from her bag strap and said something plain and useful and kind. "It is," she said. "It absolutely is." She set down her pen and he set down his paper, and she came around the table and sat beside him, and he put his arm around her, and they sat in the lamplight with the spring night outside, and the sound of their sleeping children in the rooms behind them, and the whole accumulated life of them, both in every corner of the stone-walled house, and they were, both of them, exactly where they were supposed to be. The gate still stood at the northern edge of the property. He had replaced the cedar posts twice and the crossbeam once, but the sign was the original Hunter Ranch, carved in the letters of a 22-year-old who had arrived with nothing but determination, and it still hung there in all weathers, weathered now to a silver gray, entirely legible. The latch he had improved substantially after that April morning, because he was a man who fixed things properly once he understood what needed fixing, and the latch had never worked loose again. But on certain mornings, when the sky was that particular pale, brilliant blue that Kansas wore in spring, and the wind came clean off the plains, and his wife was in the kitchen behind him making coffee and talking to whoever of the children was up earliest, he would walk down to the gate in the early light for no particular reason and stand there for a moment, looking at the road. He was not waiting for anything. He was not looking for anything. He already had everything. He was simply remembering, with the specific, grateful memory of a man who knows exactly what his life turned on. The morning the latch worked loose and the gate swung open, and a woman walked down the road toward him with her head up and her chin raised and the whole sky behind her, and he had looked up once, and then twice, and then the third time, which had been the beginning of everything. It had been a Tuesday in April in the spring of 1879, in a cattle town on the Kansas border, at 9:30 in the morning, with the meadowlarks making their noise and the sky so blue it made the eyes water. He had been 34 years old and alone. He was no longer either of those things. And the road that ran past his gate was just a road, dusty in summer and muddy in spring and frozen in winter. But on certain mornings, it was also the road that had brought him Augusta Kendrick, and on those mornings he looked at it with the same feeling he looked at his land and his house and his children and his wife, with the full, quiet, unassailable knowledge that this was his life. And it was good, and it was going to go on being good, day by day and year by year and season by season. For as long as the plains ran and the sky held, and the two of them held on to each other, which was, by any reasonable measure, going to be forever.